have a lot of work to go through. Last week when we were reading the first of, I think it's going to be 3 reading sessions to get through this Venice versus Leibniz, the battle for a science of economy. We were introduced not only to Leibniz, the person, the statesman, and the scientist, what he did, but also we were introduced to some of the key political battles that were happening around the time historically, right, when it was a period that saw the growth of the Renaissance, this idea of the human mind being created in the image of a creative force of God, and God was not defined as simply this tyrannical being to be obedient to, but rather a being of love and reason and wisdom. That's what guided the best thinkers of the Renaissance and applied that concept in an inspired way in the form of statecraft, laws, economic policy. So Leibniz was a representative of that tradition in opposition to a new school that was unleashed by the modern day sophists from the cult of modern Delphi, from Venice. And we remember that we had characters like Paolo Sarpi, who were introduced as one of the key figures who reorganized the Venetian, the oligarchical methods of control from the old methods of just simple suppression of ideas, which didn't work anymore. The fire was too strong, to the Delphic technique of simply saying, okay, we accept ideas, we'll embrace them, we'll say we love ideas, but we'll redefine what ideas are and how the mind works by basing everything into sense perception, and saying that sense perception is the cause of how the mind makes discoveries. Now, that they knew that was not true, and they knew that anybody who believed that was going to be mentally castrated and thus, an unwitting slave. So there were certain characters that were introduced who were on Sarpi's payroll as part of this Venetian operation against the Renaissance, among which were Galileo, who got his direct funding from Paolo Sarpi, who was also an enemy of Kepler. Kepler being the predecessor to Leibniz in many ways, who set forth the challenge for future mathematicians to discover what later became known as the infinitesimal calculus that Leibniz did discover. We had also people like Francis Bacon who were briefly introduced, but only briefly. I think Michael is going to go through this a little bit more in depth. And then later on, when Leibniz is around, there was direct battles with the Sarpian movement, which had at that point transplanted itself from Venice and Amsterdam to Britain through the Glorious Revolution and the creation of the Bank of England. And that's where we saw the Leibniz-Newton battle take place. Right. And then also one of the other figures who represented the British Empire interests was a figure named John Locke, who believed in blank slate, who represented this Aristotelian view of mankind as simply a blank slate to be written on by an elite in his essays on human understanding. And that's where I think we began to sort of leave off, was some of these political battles in Britain, where Leibniz was on the one hand doing an intellectual battle with Locke, with Hobbes, with Newton, but also was engaged in a geopolitical grand design with networks of humanists who were operating in Britain in opposition to this takeover that was occurring. And these better humanists represented people like, were represented by people like Jonathan Swift, Harley, others in that network. I don't know if am I forgetting anything here for the audience who might be listening at home? Is there anything else that they should have in mind when reading this?
Oh, that's okay.
That's okay? Okay. All right, so let's do a screen share. Share screen. Okay. Okay. Is this okay? Dynamic of the nation state.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
So who would like to start dynamic of the nation state?
Okay, I'll start.
Okay.
The dynamic of the nation state. Leibniz's science of reason and causes was the guiding hand in building a republican movement that could defend the rights of man according to the Westphalian intention, capable of cutting through the empiricist sophistry that had gripped Europe as a whole. In the years after his return from France in 1676, Leibniz organized more broadly for the creation of academies of science in each European capital, working in close contact with one another, supported by rulers who likewise sought to promote the common good and general welfare of mankind. In contrast to most of the academies in Europe, which, having abandoned Da Vinci's inseparability between scientific experiment and improving man's condition, were thus devoted only to the satisfaction of curiosity. Leibniz's academies were designed to channel the development of the arts and sciences for the benefit of the countries and their inhabitants through the promotion of manufacturing, industry, and commerce. This would be done, as he said, in order that, quote, the Republic of Scientists were no longer a mere phrase, but became a well-organized and prosperous great power, a federation of learned societies doing their best to civilize mankind through the expansion of sciences. Guided by the principle that the purpose of science was to apply discoveries to increase man's power over nature, he wrote, quote, sciences and arts are the only genuine wealth of people, which distinguishes them from animals and discriminates between civilized nations and barbarians. As the promotion of society is the only basis for a standard of value, real scientific economy is based on this intrinsic value of creativity, in contrast to Venetian monetarism. Just as Leibniz's own scientific discoveries were made in accordance with demonstrating the nature of a universe which placed man's reason as the guiding hand above all, Leibniz's creation of the academies of science were proscribed, guided, and later established from this highest standpoint of bringing mankind out of its infancy and freeing it from the monetarism and usury of Venice, defeating Venice's renewed Sarpi empiricism, which promoted science but outlawed discovery and thereby relegated all economy to monetarism. While Leibniz's entire intent was moving in this direction, Venice was moving to spread its monetary empire to colonize England as a new base for their bestial operation to bring an end to the Westphalian era and civilization itself. England, which incidentally served to define that very question for the future of Europe and America. This brings us now to the heart of our tale. 1. The battlefield of England. As the decade of the 1690s came to a close, with England's lifeblood being sucked dry, Leibniz reflected on the growing torrent of cultural decay of Sarpi's spawned empiricism. Quote, I even find that somewhat similar opinions, stealing gradually into the minds of men of high station who rule the rest and on whom affairs depend, and by slithering into fashionable books, are inclining towards the universal revolution with which Europe is threatened, and completing the destruction of what still remains in the world of the generous sentiments of the ancient Greeks and Romans, who placed love of country and of the public good and the welfare of future generations before fortune and even before life. This public spirit, as the English call it, is dwindling away and is no longer in fashion. It will die away all the more when it ceases being sustained by the good morality and true religion which natural reason itself teaches us. They sneer openly at love of country, and they ridicule those who are concerned for the public good. And when some well-meaning man speaks of the prospects of posterity, they say, let the future look after itself. Although, excuse me, although officially occupied by agents for Venetian empiricism and empire since the reign of James I, such as Hobbes and Bacon, the Venetians didn't officially move to take over England until 1688. Fed up with the Stuarts' resistance to setting up a central bank like Amsterdam, and their refusal to being used against France for war, Venetian agents had been conspiring to overthrow the king since the 1670s, led by Ashley Cooper, founder of the Whig Party, who, incidentally, had been in exile since 1681 for this very reason.
I just realized Ashley Cooper, that's the grandfather of the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was the creator of political Zionism. Huh. I didn't realize that. Probably great-grandfather, actually.
Then, in 1688, England was fully invaded by 20,000 men and 500 ships. A junto of mostly Whig aristocrats who allied with the Netherlands invasion by the House of Orange became the leadership of the government, many around the circle of Cooper, some traders in England, other go-betweens like Netherlands ambassador John Churchill. The plan was to indebt and loot England, use it for war speculation, and eventually turn England into Venice.
Okay, footnote 19. So yeah, like usual, remember we'll read the footnotes at the end of every paragraph that they show up in. Footnote 19 is, pretty sure I read this. Anyway, English Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, grandson of a Venetian merchant, wrote as much in 1844 when he said, the great object of the Whig leaders in England in 1688 was to establish in England a high aristocratic republic on the model of the Venetian. William III told the Whig leaders, I will not be a doge. The reign of Anne was a struggle between the Venetian and the English systems. George I was a doge. George II was a doge. George III tried not to be a doge, but he could not rid himself of the Venetian constitution.
Patriots of nations don't submit to a foreign empire so quickly, however, and despite the long corruption of England since the Venetian companies moved in under James I in 1603, the culture itself still had a kernel of sovereign impulse, led by patriots and collaborators of Leibniz, such as Robert Harley and Daniel Defoe. In 1691, they issued a plan to fight the speculative war debt being created by the imported Dutch finance through a national land bank for development and regulation of interest rates to be in accord with the necessity of the physical economy. This was a job for John Locke, the junto's main propagandist, having come over in Queen Mary's baggage in 1688 after living in exile with his sponsor Cooper. After attempting to justify the Venetian coup with his treatises on government the previous year, he met Harley's rational plan with his own sophistry, rehashing some economic arguments of the Venetian allied Salamancan school, which he had plagiarized, such as Martin de Azpilicueta Navarro. Locke effectively said, your plan would upset the bestial society which the Venetians had run the whole operation of bringing orange in the first place, and that would really cramp the style of their attempt to load debt and destruction upon Europe.
That was the author Michael Kirsch paraphrasing. Probably not a direct quote.
But probably pretty close.
Probably pretty close to the sentiment, yeah.
Thus lying, and saying anything necessary to get his point across. Locke attacked any government direction of the economy, control over currency, or any limit on interest rate to prevent speculation, arguing that the market sets the right value. Quote, things must be left to find their own price, as the natural interest is set by an unknowable force. Money is money, Locke said, and can never be brought under control, just because I said so, and you are too confused by my sophistry to disagree. After such disorientation was spread, Charles Montague, treasurer, key leader of the Venetian junto, and part of the welcoming committee of the foreign invaders, established the Bank of England in 1694 through an Act of Parliament, which was founded by William Paterson, an imported student of the Bank of Amsterdam. Montague then organized large loans through the private bank, controlled not by the king, but Parliament, and while supposedly helping the war-torn economy, created a giant monetary debt out of thin air, a quantity for speculation and impoverishment of England, proceeding to push through dictatorial financial decisions for the economy, while never once issuing anything for development. For the job, Montague selected the alchemist and calculating machine Isaac Newton, appointing him Warden of the Mint to carry out the enormous data processing job involved in the lying and faking on behalf of the numerous transitions in the economy for the sake of the empire, such as a gruesome recoinage which cut the people's wealth in half. Footnote 29. Footnote 20.
20, yeah. Newton immediately proffered his niece for sexual favors to Montague in payment for the appointment, and for extra credit, as Warden of the Mint, Newton personally advocated the death penalty and torture for petty thieves of coin wherever possible. Beautiful guy.
Yes. In the face of all this, some of the English patriots continued to fight, as parliamentarian Robert Price rallied. How can we hope for happy days in England when this great lord and other foreigners are in the English and also in the Dutch councils? I foresee that when we are reduced to extreme poverty, as now we are very near it, we are to be supplanted by our neighbors and become a colony of the Dutch. By 1697, a deliberately forced depression and credit crunch left England weakened and subdued for the junto to then give the bank a monopoly over all banking and the appointment of Montague as prime minister. The financial takeover by Venice was complete, and the Parliament ruled the bank as the de facto government, as all policy making was absorbed into it. Montague took a trip to Venice the next year to report on the success of the operation. The nation of England, thrown into war and looted, was being successfully colonized, just as the Netherlands had before. Okay.
What's that? That was a picture of the sealing of the Bank of England Charter in 1694. Okay. Does someone else want to pick up the reading?
Gerald's doing pretty good. Continue.
All right. Your reading has been approved by Eureka. Gerald.
Okay, I'll continue while I still have a voice here. Leibniz's flank. However, unlike what the Venetian empiricists would have hoped, history is guided dynamically, and the idea behind the Westphalian system acted in ways beyond their comprehension, with a struggle ensuing, having far-reaching consequences. Gottfried Leibniz had begun working for the Duke of Brunswick in the House of Hanover in 1680, recruiting his wife Sophie and her daughter Sophie Charlotte to his view, that only a movement of educated reason could defeat the arbitrary power of Venetian manipulated assemblies and rulers. In 1690, he had begun a history of Hanover for the Duke, gaining access to many libraries for this task. By 1692, Leibniz discovered a flank against Venice. Leibniz demonstrated that Hanover, in which the House of Brunswick resided, was in fact next in line for the English succession following Anne, daughter of James II. After organizing for his claim, his finding was made official in 1696, and by 1701 Robert Harley succeeded in getting the Parliament to pass the Act of Settlement, guaranteeing this Hanoverian succession. To the European theater in the war against Venice's takeover, when Queen Anne took the throne in 1702, this meant that Gottfried Leibniz, the renowned leader against empiricism and advocate and warrior of the Westphalian system, could be personally advising the head of state of England at any given time. On the opposing side, when Anne came to power, the Venetian junto moved in to make her its tool, as William of Orange had been, and relations with Hanover, where Leibniz was advising now Electress Sophie, were tightly controlled. Things came to a head in 1705 when Leibniz and his circles conspired for a visit of Sophie to London in order to directly influence Anne against the junto. Montague's network blocked the action by means of an open letter circulated to embarrass Queen Anne and smear Leibniz's name. And subsequently, Montague personally visited Hanover, attempting to secure the crown for the junto over Leibniz in the case of Anne's death. And in there was footnote
21, which simply said her husband, the Duke of Brunswick, had died in 1696, putting her next in line.
Other, more covert opportunities would have to be taken, and Leibniz's allies around the court began secretly educating Anne in the principles of the nation-state, including Republican intelligence operative extraordinary, and Leibniz's main ally in the Isles, Jonathan Swift. Secretary of State Harley was on the verge of achieving peace with France in July 1706 when the junto struck back, demanding Harley be booted out and replaced by one of their own. Anne resisted, and her intention began manifesting itself against them, leading to a breakthrough when Swift personally came to England in 1708, and Anne began moving openly against Venice's interests in favor of England, even seeking to replace her Venetian junto prime minister. The Swift-Leibniz faction was threatening takeover. The junto, in a panic, pulled out all the stops. Montague flagged his asset at the Mint, now president of the Royal Society, Newton, and a proposal for a public defamation campaign against Leibniz was written out. John Churchill, head of the army in the ongoing war with France, and who had had the most control over the Queen, personally blackmailed her by threatening resignation unless Harley was dismissed. The Queen submitted. Harley resigned, and the Venetian junto subsequently filled every post in the cabinet. Having won the battle, the penned accusation of plagiarism against Leibniz was shelved for the time.
Right, that's footnote 22. This was an accusation that Leibniz had not discovered the principle of the infinitesimal calculus, but had taken it from Newton.
But the junto had overplayed its hand, and Anne was simply waiting for an opportunity to bring the swift Leibniz circles in to save her nation, who in turn used ironic wit and the enemy's own mistakes against them. When Swift returned to England in August 1710, the junto ministry was cleaned out by the end of the month. Under these new circumstances, the idea of Leibniz coming to London with Sophie was an ever-present threat in the minds of the Venetians and the Dutch invaders. Montague's precious rant. Realizing their defeat, the Venetian junto raged and took every other route they could to discredit Leibniz, whose influence they could feel but not understand. Only 2 months after being ejected from the ministry, it initiated its latent attack on Leibniz. Montague, steered from Venice, advised his asset at the Royal Society, Isaac Newton, that for the role he was to play in the subsequent period, it would be wise to move the society to a location that would be more supportive of the new agenda, to London's financial district. In November, the Royal Society, which had always been located at Gresham College, was moved to Crane Court by diktat, against the desires of the majority of the Academy, by Newton in 1710. With this done, the charge of plagiarism penned in 1708 was now issued in the public forum of the Royal Society proceedings from the new Royal Society in the financial district of London. Meanwhile, with Harley as Prime Minister, England gained a respite from willful looting and destruction of the economy, and his original 1691 plan for a national land bank was pushed through and started to make the means for economic development available for the country, and began to alleviate the debt which had been created. Despite attempts to stall increases of available money through the use of tool Newton at the Mint, Harley's government corporation served as a driver for development. Leibniz endorsed this plan, communicating to the Harley cabinet, "Your new ministry disabused those foreigners who had doubted if it would contribute, as it has, to the general situation. For one can say that it surpasses its predecessor, not only in paying the costs of the present, but also in making good those of the past and satisfying the debts of the nation." In this new context, Leibniz devised a second attempt to bring Sophie and himself to London to strengthen the validity and resolve of Harley's ministry. In desperation, Montague had his asset Newton at the Royal Society issue a rant in April 1712 about anything but the infinitesimal calculus, declaring himself its originator and demanding Leibniz to never have existed. This rant was subsequently praised by the financiers and bank parasites in the court, and in the wake of the fraud, they used this official ruling of plagiarism to their effect, wielding it as leverage to move against Leibniz directly. Thus, when a new visit for Sophie to London was officially made in September of that year, it was blocked, this time despite the dominant Harley ministry. The anti-Leibniz faction in Anne's cabinet began to attack him from within and personally encouraged Anne to prevent the visit. In addition, Montague himself had appeared at Hanover, counseling Venice's Hanoverian asset, George Ludwig, against Sophie making the trip. George subsequently moved to cut Leibniz's salary in Hanover. In the aftermath of this, Leibniz wrote the next month to an ally in the ministry of the difficulty. You will have received my letter where I spoke to you of the plot that I learned of to attack me in your country.
Footnote 23 is, this is known as Newton's Commercium Epistolicum Collini Liorum Dianalysia Promota, his official ruling from the Royal Society of Leibniz as a plagiarist. The rant, being issued in April 1712, was later printed and distributed more generally in the spring of 1713. I love, the entire battle as well between, like, many people know of the Bank of England story and the creation of the Bank of England as a private central bank to take over England. But the opposing battle against that of the creation of a national land bank, I never see anybody ever make mention of that, which opens the door to the broader real story, right? It's just, and the fact that it plays right into the battle in mathematics, these two different paradigms of mathematics, one a monetary, the Newtonian mathematics, which has all of its assumptions about the way the universe works, versus the Leibnizian version, which actually is in conformity with creative reason instead of just being an imposition of like information theory or like computer thinking onto the human mind. It's very lawful.
Mm-hmm. Okay. When Sophie died in May 1714 of natural causes, Anne was no longer seen as a necessity to block Leibniz's control of England under Sophie, and she herself died within weeks of Sophie, with similar symptoms to those of the wife, son, grandson, and nephew of Louis XIV, who were all lethally poisoned in 1712. The newly crowned Venetian asset, King George, immediately rejected the peace plan with France, accomplished by Harley and Anne, and made Charles Montague his prime minister. Venice, whom he had served, was pleased. Leibniz wrote to his ally in Hanover, Caroline of Ansbach, Princess of Wales, that it was not Sophie, but England that was lost by her death. The threat of Leibniz coming to power in England and coordinating a broader alliance of nation-states dynamically influenced all of the actions of the oligarchy in England from 1702 to 1714. With this threat removed under junto asset King George in 1714, there was no obstacle the Venetian empire of monetarism could not then overcome. England was now destined to be the seat of the British New World Monetary Empire by the close of 2 generations later.
So now we have arrived at the short and long interests of Venice. Kwan, you wanna read this one?
Yes, sure. So the short and long interests of Venice. Despite the colonization of England, Leibniz was scoring victories elsewhere around the world for the movement of creative reason. Near the time of the Peace of Utrecht accomplished by Harley in 1713 between France and England, Leibniz was on the verge of a triple alliance between the policies of England, Austria, and Russia. Through his long-time conspiracies with Republicans in Europe, Leibniz's influence over Charles of Austria was growing, and with whose father Leopold I he had been in correspondence since the 1690s. In 1712, Charles appointed him imperial privy councillor, and beginning January 1713, he personally spent nearly 2 years in Vienna working with Charles and his allies on various projects, including the development of the industry and raw materials of Austria, an alliance with Russia, and potentially Sophie, England. During this time, Charles adopted Leibniz's design for an Academy of Sciences center in Vienna, with Leibniz appointed by Charles as its president. It was modeled on the success of the Leibniz design Berlin Academy, founded in 1700. In October 1711, Peter Red asked Leibniz in person to rewrite the mathematics, scientific, and economic program for Russia, and a year later, Peter made Leibniz Privy Councillor of Justice. Peter began implementing many of Leibniz's projects and designs, with Leibniz writing to Peter, quote, "I am not one of those who love only their motherland or any single nation. All my thoughts are turned to the benefit of mankind, because I consider the heavens to be my mother country and all sensible person its fellow citizens. My ultimate goal is to increase general prosperity. I prefer seeing an upsurge in the development of sciences in Russia than there is progress in Germany. A country where sciences sustain continuous growth will be dearest to me, because this country is most likely to promote and thus to contribute to the general good of mankind." End of quote.
Good. And there's a footnote 24 in there, which said over 1696 to 1716, Leibniz had five meetings with Peter the Great on 2 occasions for weeks at a time, and was in constant correspondence.
Berlin.
By the way, I just wanted to point out, I was just reading Gödel's writings on Leibniz, Kurt Gödel, and the point that is brought up shockingly is that even to this very day, the majority of Leibniz's writings and correspondences remain out of the public view. They're all, you can't read them, even if you wanted to. Like 70% of them, we know they exist. They're registered as existing, but you can't access them. I got to look more into like who the hell has the lock and key to this thing. But yeah, it's scandalous.
How strange. The usual suspects. Okay, continuing. Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg were all implementing Leibniz's anti-empiricist scientific model of discovery. During the same time, his work of many years to demonstrate the futility of the Protestant-Catholic conflict, which Venice had used to beat back the nation-state, was beginning to bear fruit, and Leibniz had been commissioned to organize an alliance between Austria and Russia to end war with France. Therefore, consider now what is relevant to understanding the process we have been investigating so far in this report. The takeover and destruction of science and civilization by Venice, and Leibniz's ingenious routing of that plan. Consider those intersecting intentions from the standpoint of the implications for Venice of certain predicates of his broader organizing of conspirators for an alliance of reason. As the vortex for all the great statesmen of Europe, the potential which he had built up through his meetings and correspondences were coming to fruition faster than Venice could keep track. It would appear that despite Venice's political victory in England, the power of Leibniz ideas themselves, and the blossoming of creative thought which they had borne throughout Europe, meant that a longer term generational success for Venice was impossible. And from that standpoint, consider the events which has occurred in the run up to that, which is now unfolded here. Enter Abbé Antonio Spinella Conti. Faced with the explosion of Leibniz's victories, the Venetian empire was fanatic, and acting on the longer wave historical impulse, Abbé Antonio Spinella Conti, theologian in the tradition of Paolo Sarpi and Francesco Zorzi, having been selected as a top intelligence agent and specifically groomed for this task since 1708, was deployed north in 1713. Conti was posing as a follower of Leibniz metaphysics and made inroads into Leibniz political networks, particularly with Leibniz's key correspondent in the French court, Nicolas Raymond, the chief counselor for the next ruler of France. By these means, and making a show, Leibniz correspondents sung Conti's praises as a scholar, and Conti was able to attract Leibniz's attention as a possible ally. Although Leibniz was skeptical of the renown of his work, raising the question whether Conti could rid himself of the spur of wanting to be original. Conti's level of sophistication was from the heart of Venice's interests. When in 1715, Conti wrote to Leibniz offering his assistance to work on his behalf in London, Leibniz took his chances in using him to remove the blockade to his passage into London. George Ludwig of Hanover, now King George I of England, had long been a Venetian dupe and had, since his crowning in the summer, his crowning probably.
Crowning, yeah, probably.
Yeah. Since his crowning in the summer of 1714, proceeded to keep Leibniz from entering London when he returned to Hanover from Charles VI's side in Vienna to resume his post he had had for the preceding 40 years as Privy Councillor of Justice and choreographer, as he was supposed to have traveled to England with Caroline of Ansbach and the new king. At that time, with Montague as minister under George I, his personal project of the Newton hoax was increasingly used for the purposes of the empire. In fact, it was the main obstacle to his entrance. And likewise, also since the crowning of George I, an abundance of Leibniz allies in Hanover had been pushing the Royal Society to end the dispute in order for Leibniz to gain access to London, in addition to Leibniz himself lashing the hope with satirical wit. The 1712 ruling of the Royal Society, which had secured the main source of political capital for Montague's faction back then, was waning by 1715, and the ever unreliable Newton had worsened the situation by his wide defense of the fraud in 1714, where he feigned a supposed committee of authors when he had written the ruling himself, and spilled his silly stream of consciousness rage about infinite series and his blatant light to cover the glaring fact of the lack of any calculus in his Principia, which Leibniz had pointed out. No one with any respectability believed the sloppy liar. So we will read Matthew for note 25. Matthew, it's your turn for note 25.
Yeah, sorry, my cat was bouncing off the walls. I had to let her out.
No problem.
Okay, footnote 25. In Newton's 1714 account of the book entitled Commercia, Newton exposed himself among similar examples, saying, quote, by the help of the new analysis, that is the infinitesimal calculus, Mr. Newton found out most of the propositions in his Principia Philosophiae. But because the ancients, for making things certain, admitted nothing into geometry before it was demonstrated synthetically, he demonstrated the propositions synthetically, that the system of the heavens might be founded upon good geometry. And this makes it now difficult for unskillful men to see the analysis by which those propositions were found. What a pompous bastard. And he's speaking of himself in the first person, too.
Well, it's not so bad at the first person.
But the idea that, that he didn't ever state how in the book how he discovered the infinitesimal calculus, but he's like, they're implicit in my discoveries. You must be stupid if you don't think that or don't see it.
Wow. He said very politely that it would be difficult for unskillful man to understand these things.
Right. Yeah, just appealing to people's sense of ego. That's not me. No, I'm very skillful. No, I see it. Yes.
So continuing, Newton and the Royal Society would have blown the whole operation. So in what otherwise would have been handled in the usual Newton way, entirely incompetent and useless for Venice's desires, Abbé Conti, out of the very bowels of Venice's satanic temples, personally intervened, and it's your turn for note 26.
Yeah, so 26. Just as Newton had botched his debates over plagiarism of light with Huygens and Hooke, and recklessly bullying, theft, and suppression of royal astronomer John Flamsteed's work. Ugh. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a little book on Newton and Flamsteed, and how it's just so cruel. Like Flamsteed was like an honest guy in the Royal Society who just really wanted to know, like, how did you discover gravity? How did you do it? And he kept on pushing to get an answer. And when Newton was getting pissed off, Newton went out of his way to destroy this guy. He like slandered him, made conspiracies, like really destroyed him over a sustained period. Really cruel. Made sure he got no commissions, no jobs. Like, anyway, yeah, it's pretty bad.
Well, the true conspiracist was Newton then.
Yeah.
Okay, so with George I securely in place to make his move, the door to the inner circle of his court was an easy passage for Conti in 1715 to then act the part of Venice's immediate interests. In its then state of desperation against its immortal foe in every and any possible way. First, Conti secured the continued blockade of Leibniz by salvaging the plagiarism fraud. Conti personally renewed the idea of settling the non-existing dispute, and then personally had the husband of King George's mistress call for a public display of letters between Newton and Leibniz. Conti next convinced Leibniz that if he acted as direct go-between, he could get Newton to concede and clear the way for Leibniz's entry into London. Taking him up, Leibniz wrote a letter showing that Newton's hopes had nothing to do with the calculus and his claims limited to infinite series. Conti then personally coaxed Newton into replying, rekindling his petty rage. Having won his aim in reigniting the embers of controversy, Conti could then begin openly working against Leibniz and reported that he had been won over to the other side. Note 27.
Yeah, 27 is the subtle inconsistency instantly exposed to Leibniz Conti's character, and Leibniz was onto his agenda, noting his miraculous conversion to Newtonian philosophy. Quote, "He does not appear to have fixed principles and is similar to a chameleon who takes the color of the things which it touches."
Secondly, having successfully blocked Leibniz's entry to England, Conti acted on another issue near and dear to Venice's long-term interests. Of all of the reasons for the Venetians to hate and fear Leibniz, during his research for the history and origins of Hanover since the 1680s, including his stay in Venice in 1689 to 1690, he had poked into very sensitive areas which the Venetians held sacred. On his departure for Hanover in 1690, Leibniz noted, quote, "I am about to return home after a long journey undertaken by order of my prince for the purpose of historical investigations. There were contradictions and errors on the matter in the historians of Este, together with a complete confusion of houses and persons." End of quote. The house of Este was, in addition to being the leading house of Hanover, the most avid house for the dissolution of the Westphalian system and a return to the Ultramontane system, where the arbitrary law of one emperor overrides and disarms the sovereignty of the laws passed by nations. Leibniz's views on the history of the House of Este and what other facts he may have found brought the Venetian hatred of Leibniz to a boil. Note 28.
Okay, 28. 28. What evidence against Venice was in his broader history of Europe relating to the division of the churches, which Leibniz had sought so long to unify, and which was Venice's basis for continuous war and friction between the nations? What other secrets concerning the House of Este's campaign against the Renaissance did they want buried?
Venice knew that Leibniz's history of Hanover, near publication in 1713, was to include his work on the House of Este, in addition to Leibniz's expressed intention to publish his historical work as a fuller, complete history of the peoples of Europe. Thereby did Abbot Giuseppe Riva, chief secretary of the Este family working then in Hanover, exchange letters with Italian historian Lodovico Muratori around the same time that Montague triggered the Royal Society to make its plagiarist claim. Riva utilized the fact that Leibniz had borrowed historical manuscripts on the House of Este to drum up more whispers of plagiarisms against Leibniz. But of infinitely more importance to Venice was to preempt and discredit Leibniz's own publication. Thus, in 1716, Conti brought Riva and Newton to his house to strategize, and subsequently, Conti personally had the message delivered to Muratori that he must publish a history before Leibniz, and rewarded him kindly for doing so. Third, with Leibniz kept out of London, Conti moved to extinguish any of his remaining influence. After having blown up the plagiarism hoax, Conti ensured an end to Leibniz's further influence inside the court, and with the help of court chaplain and one of Newton's handlers, Samuel Clarke, began conducting long brainwashing sessions of Caroline, wife of future King George II, and Leibniz's closest ally remaining in the court. For the brainwashing, Caroline reported to Leibniz that Conti has taken the trouble to lose some of the papers of Leibniz which she had been studying. Conti proceeded to guide Clarke's hand the correspondence with Leibniz, which drew out the true face and reason for what would be Conti's subsequent ask. Clearly, the depths and range of Leibniz's influence in England and other venues require nothing short than the personal act of Venice. However, all of this so far was merely damage control and did nothing in the way of dealing with the sticky subject for Venice of the power of the human mind, which they so loathe, nor the effects of its creativity in continuing to subvert the model which Paolo Sarpi had hoped to achieve, the unleashing of all of which Leibniz had directed, and whose minds continue existing, ensure creativity's victory over Venice. With Venice's motive now in mind, the following becomes clear. Once the Venetian priest had caught wind of Leibniz's death, Newton received a letter, quote, "Leibniz is dead. The dispute is finished," end of quote. In the mind that wrote those simple words, a radical shift in intention occurred, and as though channeling Sarpi's soul from hell, his longer mission to destroy creativity itself began. Having personally stoked the flames of the fake controversy with Newton, the potential which Conti gained through the Royal Society hoax leading up to Leibniz's death was a mere first step. Immediately after Leibniz's death, Conti began preparations for a distinct shift in Newton's usefulness for Venice, this time for a much more long-standing purpose, whose effect lies as far as the causes of global wreckage in today's collapse of civilization and present obstacles to success. Under the celebrity of Newton, Descartes' soul would be revived, and mathematics would officially return as the only standard of truth, with mass conversions of its followers to a new empiricist religion. But who really was Isaac Newton? The answer is that Isaac Newton, or as he named and considered himself, Jehovah Sanctus Unus,
which means God's Holy One.
which is very very humble from him,
Oh yeah.
would would never have been but a passing name today had it not been for Gottfried Leibniz. The real Newton was a nobody whose only significance in his lifetime was as a mere tool for the successful colonization of England by Venice. And after Leibniz's death, Newton, the religion, was used to colonize the minds of the rest of Europe, and unfortunately, most of the world still today.
Eureka, would you like to read?
Okay.
Just make sure you're speaking close to your device.
Swamp creatures come from swamps. At the end of the 16th century and beginning of the 17th, through correspondence and collaboration of Francis Bacon, Robert Flood, and others, Sarpi succeeded in consolidating what Zorzi had begun to achieve in England, making his inroads in an attempted political takeover of existing science in that country. The British Rosicrucian heirs of Bacon's Oxford Society created the Royal Society, exerting a growing influence in the name of science over Europe. Its black magic and alchemical Rosicrucian cults mystically communicated with a god who was revived and popularized by Venetian operatives against the nation state, which Sarpi in turn communicated to his followers in secret as the state religion of Venice. Created out of the hatred of the reciprocal relationship which existed after the 1440 Council of Florence between Christianity and acts of scientific discovery, the agenda going back to Pomponazzi and Contarini was to theologically find a way to deny the existence of human creativity, and with it, the conception of man congruent with the existence of commonwealths and nation states. The product was the anti-Trinitarian God of arbitrary, irrational will on the one side and the infinitely sinful man on the other.
Okay. Footnote 30 is just a reference to footnote 1, so yeah, don't worry about it.
Underscored by the presence of these governing social forces, and as already been indicated, nearly all the details of Newton's person are irrelevant. What is necessary is to understand how Isaac Newton was fertile ground to serve as a host and receptacle of the anti-human ideas which had thoroughly infiltrated England. Although exposed to it earlier, Newton's real devotion to alchemy began in 1667 after returning to Cambridge and working with Barrow. Newton began reading and making extensive notes in such Rosicrucian tracts as Themis, Aurea, and Symbola, Aureo, Mensae, Dudacem,
I don't know.
and the fame and confession of the fraternity RC.
Rosicrucian.
He adopted the Rosicrucian view that if one followed the secrets of Rosicrucianism, one would become part of a superior race that could talk to angels, become immortal through discovering the secret elixir, and indefinitely wealthy through possession of the philosopher's stone. Performing all of the steps of alchemy in trying to find the secret of turning lead into gold, in 1675, he met up with professional alchemist Robert Boyle, and later that year wrote Flavius the Key, the pinnacle of his 6 years of work on alchemy.
You have to
For
sound like a crazy person when you're reading this, Eureka, now, okay?
For alchemy does not trade with metals as ignorant vulgars think, which error has made them distress that noble science, but she has also material veins of whose nature God created handmaidens to conceive and bring forth its creatures. Concerning magnesia or the green line, it is called Prometheus and the chameleon, also androgen.
I got androgyne. I don't know.
Yeah,
Androgyny.
androgen.
Androgen.
Yeah,
Androgen.
exactly.
And virgin verdant earth, in which the sun has never cast its rays, although he is its father, and the moon its mother. Also common mercury dew of heaven, which makes the earth fertile. Nitre of the wise, it is the Saturnine stone. By 1678, he had constructed 47 axioms of alchemy, having conducted all the rituals himself. This real biological Newton connected with what he thought were the hidden mysteries of God in his way, and through his secret knowledge predicted the end of the world coming soon, and came to the conclusion that the universe was created in 4004 BC. His library eventually swelled up to 130 heavily annotated books on alchemy and many of the major Rosicrucian texts. At the same time, by 1670, Newton had also been converted to the anti-Trinitarian cults, which had been created and imported from Venice. Newton did not publicly espouse this view, as it would have cost him his mathematics chair and his later controllers much more. He, however, did introduce his assistant professor, William Whiston, to the faith, who was consequently kicked out of the post in 1710, later saying, "They persecuted me for the very same doctrines which the great Sir
Isaac Newton.
Isaac Newton had discovered and embraced my years before me. Had he ventured as plainly and openly to publish them to the world as I thought myself obliged to do, they must 30 or 40 years ago have expelled and persecuted the great Sir Isaac Newton also." Whiston had added that Newton's writings and beliefs concerning the Trinity in particular were occasionally known to those few who were intimate with him all along, from whom, notwithstanding his prodigiously fearful, cautious, and suspicious temper, he could not always conceal so important a discovery, and that for the subject, Newton long appeared to him to have been one of the greatest masters that ever was.
Oh, there was a footnote 32. Later in 1716, when Whiston applied for a membership to the Royal Society, Newton, the president, threatened to resign if he came on. Politically, it would have been a serious damper to Conti's operation in full swing that year.
So when Leibniz sent him a letter in 1675, having caught wind of his collaboration with Barrow on quadratures using infinite series, Newton reluctantly pulled himself away from the cauldron to write a response, adding, "For having other things in my head, it proved an unwelcome interruption to me to be at this time put upon considering these things. These were the other things in Newton's head, and were in fact the very reason Newton would be picked up by the Venetian junto in England and serve as a controllable servant in his subsequent roles he would play for them. Only by understanding this, as will be subsequently shown, does anything about Newton make sense. But it is important to stress that unlike those witting Venetian hands, Zorzi, Sarpi, and their associates, or direct correspondents Bacon and Hobbes, Newton was never anything more than an unfortunate, deranged individual whose susceptible soul had been successfully caught in this guiding dynamic. A new Venetian torture manual. When England was being prepared for its later takeover by the Venetian colonized Netherlands in the 1680s, it was out of these networks behind the Royal Society who selected a then ripe for the picking Isaac Newton as a name to stick on a book whose multiple reincarnations would prove, looking back a century later, to have nearly destroyed almost every era of European science. This was the first step in biological Newton's long political career as active Venetian pawn. In Johannes Kepler's discovery of universal gravitation, he had experimentally demonstrated the solar system and implicitly the universe as being governed by a knowable principle of creative reason, a science of causes, where reality lay not merely in collecting sense impressions alone, but in irony understood only by the human mind. The Principia was created to serve as the indisputable manual and method for science, as a replacement for Kepler's method and discovery of universal gravitation using a mathematical formula, the inverse square law, which expressed an effect named attraction. Since this mathematical formula was assumed to be able to describe all celestial phenomena, the physical cause of the sun of Kepler's new astronomy, Kepler's method of the harmonies and valid scientific method of hypothesis decide, was to be thrown out and banned from science in kinship with the Sarpi model.
Okay, footnote 33 is, as should become necessarily painfully clear to the reader in what follows, Sarpi's model is what Newton was made to be, and it is no coincidence, therefore, that the cults that promoted him put all of its effort into formulating the inverse square law, which is not a law or principle at all. In truth, that kinship is all that need be said about the book itself. However, dealing with the specific way it was put forward is necessary for understanding the broader historical and scientific principle being addressed in this report.
The supposed breakthrough of the inverse square law, which was only hailed by those who sought political favors from Montague, was simply plagiarized by mixing mathematical formulas from Kepler's 1619 harmonies of the world and Huygens' 1670 work on centrifugal force.
Okay, wait. So there, 34 is simply a fact even admitted after Newton's death by Henry Pemberton, one of his editors. Interesting.
For this task, the alchemist Newton was not required, capable, nor would have even considered it. The only thing he might have done was to resolve the trouble that the Royal Society network claimed to have had in pushing their replacement for Kepler and the human mind, that is, mathematically resolving the inverse square formula with the geometrical ellipse. What he most certainly did do for the sake of the Principia's completion was calculate, in addition to his dogmatic adherence to the Venetian state religion. Since his only experimental background was prophecy, it was the role of human calculator that Newton was chosen for the creation of the first version of this monstrosity. A student is recorded as saying, when spotting Newton walking across campus in Cambridge, there goes the man that read a book that neither he nor anybody else understands.
Okay, this is a big footnote. So I'll take a moment. Footnote 35 on the first version of the monstrosity of the Principia. It says, according to one of his family members, Jonathan Swift had described Newton as the worst companion in the world, and that if you asked him, he would revolve in a circle in his brain, round and round and round. And here Swift described a circle on his own forehead before he could produce an answer. The dean, Swift, used to also tell of Sir Isaac that his servant, having one day called him to dinner, and returning after waiting some time to call him a second time, found him mounted on a ladder balanced against the shelves of his library, a book in his left hand, and his head reclined against his right, sunk in such a fit of abstraction that he was obliged, after calling him once or twice, to actually jog him before he could awaken his attention. This was precisely the office of the flapper, of which Swift's floating island of Laputa is peopled with thousands of Newtons, each of whom are awakened from their mathematical days by flappers. Swift had captured the characteristic that, along with being a specialist in alchemy, black magic, and biblical prophecy, Newton had a form of autism which made him incapable of discovery, but a perfect calculator, and so much so that he could hardly socialize in any normal manner, operating only in very controlled environments. When Montague later made him president of the Royal Society, he altered the form of the meeting so that there was no open discussion, and one could only speak if Newton called on them. Behind closed doors, he would flaunt his sponsored status to those he thought beneath him, as in his beastly acts towards those such as Flamsteed. But in public, such as his stints in Parliament, Newton never said a word. As under confrontation, he could not function. The two cases of him opening his mouth in the public forum of Parliament was to, one, ask someone to shut a window, and two, when he read from a piece of paper, but when asked for clarification as to what he had read, sat frozen in silence. Interesting.
After this project, Newton returned to his well-deserved obscurity as an alchemist, and later suffering a mental breakdown through the summer and fall of 1692, until being given a purpose to exist from Montague, who would later use him as calculating machine in the Mint in 1696. Subsequently, when the Venetian junto was desperate for something with which to attack Leibniz, a reputation was steadily built up for him inside England. Montague himself, the former head of the Royal Society from 1695 to 1698, put Newton at the head of it in 1703 and would slowly build up his reputation in England, getting his plagiarized work on light put together and demonstrated in the controlled environment of the Royal Society, with experiments designed to create effects that fits his assumptions, and at the same time, a fake version of the calculus rewritten in fluxion notation was printed in 1704. The reputation built up would then be launched against Leibniz, which the political fate of the junto demanded it.
Okay, so 36, also a little big. The only source of Newton's account of his early discoveries related to what he mistakes for the calculus came from himself. It wasn't until after Leibniz's calculus was published in 1691 to 92 by John Bernoulli, Guillaume de l'Hôpital, and Pierre Vergniaud on the continent that John Wallis claimed Newton had something similar with infinite series and quadratures. Then the war against Leibniz, in preparation for and building up Newton against Leibniz, a supposed exposition of Newton's fluxions, was put forward by someone else in 1704, which, in addition to a mess of quadratures, faked to be original, copying Leibniz's work and changing the notation. No one in Newton's lifetime outside of England ever believed Newton discovered anything in the calculus besides a possible twist on Barrow's quadrature using infinite series, with which he never accomplished anything further, having taken up other interests, as we have seen. And this is despite the fact that Leibniz sent him a full account of his differential calculus in 1677 after receiving merely a cryptic note about infinite series and containing the mere word fluxion and tangent from Newton in 1676.
Then, upon the combined influences of the continuing intent to make England the seat of the new Venetian world empire and the continuing battle with Leibniz, the decision was made in 1708 to put out a new version of the Principia, one that would better serve the purposes for which was created, a new religious textbook for the state religion of the Venetian Empire. The old was riddled with hundreds of errors and incomplete, including its faulty lunar theory, which Flamsteed had pointed out, but above all, it had lacked the ability to perform the function for which Newton was then later to be used. And by this time, Leibniz had refuted Descartes beyond repair and put out a full physics manual, his Dynamics, in the real method of science. In order for Venice's own desperately needed English Descartes, a new Sarpi archetype was required, thus the 1713 publication of the second edition. The second version of the Principia hardly resembled the first, as it was now thoroughly corrected of the hundreds of errors over the course of 4 years, filled with new material gathered or plagiarized from other sources which contained most of the so-called substance it was later promoted as having, and in end effect being twice the size, doubling from 500 to 1,000 pages. But all of this was to give it more credibility. The real purpose was seen in that its overall presentation took on a radical form of empiricism, which led into explicit Satanism through both the denial of Leibniz metaphysics, which was gripping and circling through Europe in the 1690s with Leibniz's success, and an open declaration of Sarpi's core philosophy of sense perception, which was to replace any hypothesis whatsoever. The preface now consisted both of a direct attack against Leibniz's circulating principle of sufficient reason, which gave the nation-state patriots the upper hand and an attempt to defend themselves from attacks of atheism and the occult nature of attraction.
I think I'll just read those two footnotes right there since they're back to back. So 37 on the principle of sufficient reason. Michael Kirsch writes, in Leibniz's metaphysics or physics of the mind, pervading all of his discoveries and correspondences, he explicitly revived and stated what is implied and guides all human reasoning, that there must always be a sufficient reason why something is so rather than otherwise. Leibniz would later himself write of the Leibniz-Clark correspondence that, quote, the supporters of Mr. Newton find themselves in the necessity to deny the great principle of the need for a sufficient reason, by means of which I beat them into ruin. And in footnote 38, right, on the occult nature of Newton's attraction, Leibniz had pointed out after the first edition that Newton, the Newton crew had, quote, revived the occult qualities with the idea of attraction, since the attraction of bodies, properly so called, is a miraculous thing, since it cannot be explained by the nature of bodies.
The 9 hypotheses in the old version became the 4 rules of reasoning in the new version, in addition to the first version's Ockhamite.
Yeah, Ockhamite is a guy named William of Ockham, hundreds of years earlier, who developed this tool of reasoning, which is stupid, that basically the simplest explanation for a phenomenon is invariably the best one, which is mostly, it's almost never true. But anyway, yeah.
Causes don't exist if they can be explained by the senses simpler.
Oh, there you go.
Rule 3 asserted that there are no innate ideas in the human mind, only perceptibly derived thoughts, and Rule 4 asserted his hypotheses non fingo, both of which would also be stressed again at the end in the general scholium, which was perhaps the most significant addition to the book.
Right, and footnote 39 on hypotheses non fingo, rule number 4 is I frame no hypotheses, I don't think.
For the witting reader, these and the general scholium at the end of his second edition now openly exposed him as a creature of Sarpi, as explicitly including his membership to the anti-Trinitarian cults, for which Leibniz would later attack him in the Leibniz-Clark letters when pointing out that Newton's God of an unreasonable and winding down universe will be like the God of the how do I pronounce that?
Jerry or Quan, I don't know. Socinians?
Yeah, probably.
Socinians.
Yeah.
Okay. The footnote there is for the God of the Socinians. In exposing Newton, footnote 40, in exposing Newton as a Socinian, one of many anti-Trinitarian cults created by Venice against the Council of Florence, Leibniz had taken note that, quote, Newton's optics presented the universe as a winding down clock when it said that, quote, some very small irregularities which may have arisen from the mutual actions of the planets and comets one upon the other will in length of time increase more and more till the present system of nature shall want to be anew put in order by its author. Leibniz points out that the implication of creating a creator who, as Leibniz said, would need to, quote, wind up his watch from time to time, was merely to uphold the political agenda of a belief in an unknowable, irrational universe, so as to avoid having to use one's reason, and therefore to destroy human creativity. This view, asserted here in the Optics, was later defended by Lord Kelvin and Rudolf Clausius, who again arbitrarily asserted the exact same view, only through a new venue, that of the study of heat-powered machines. These political doctrines of entropy lead to conceptions of the universe that tolerate population reduction, mass murder environmentalism, zero growth economies, and the like. They are not scientific theories. They are religious beliefs.
Looking more closely at Newton's general scholium added at the end, we see the utmost explicit Socinian expression echoing Sarpi. What the real substance of anything is, we know not. In bodies, we see only their figures and colors. We hear only the sounds. We touch only their outward surfaces. We smell only the smells and taste the flavors, but their inward substances are not to be known either by our senses or by any reflex act of our minds.
That's a really, really useful quote. I gotta remember that. Okay, that's footnote 41. That's from Descartes' Philosophy of Physics, Part 1, Principles of Human Knowledge. Wait a minute, is that from Newton's Scholium or from Descartes? Now I'm confused.
Scholium.
No, it's the scholium.
It's from the Scholium, right?
Yeah, at
Okay,
the end of scholium.
So then he's just referencing Descartes' Principles of Philosophy, I guess, to draw a comparison in the thinking, where in the Principles of Philosophy, Part 1, Principles of Human Knowledge, Descartes says, quote, "The chief principles of human knowledge seem to me to be contained in the knowledge of a certain corporeal nature, or one extended, divisible, mobile, etc., and also the knowledge of certain sensations which affect us, for example, pain, colors, flavors, etc." Yeah, he's drawing just a parallel.
Exact.
And Leibniz had earlier on destroyed Descartes. He really went to war on Descartes with his Specimen Dynamicum paper, and also there's a few other pieces, but he really spent several years just obliterating the Descartes paradigm and persona that they created as sort of the proto-Newton before there was Newton. So that's why they had to create Newton, because he did such a good job destroying Descartes. But yeah, that's I'm going to make sure that in the description of the video, there's going to be all these links to Leibniz's writings that people can like just look over these works.
Guided by this religion of empiricism as the ever-present background, what would otherwise have been simply deemed a mathematical effect, the formula of attraction, was made into a veritable God. By the diktat of this formula, the universe is made to be a simple universe without the necessity of causes, purely sense perception, and yet is unknowable as to what orders those senses. A Sarpi law in the truest sense. It was meant to explain away any possible paradox that might reveal the nature of man as creative, the true meaning of hypothesis non bingo. Throughout the new version, the inverse square law was even more explicitly used for this satanic purpose of replacing the human mind. Physics and all science was reduced to the worship of mathematics as the self-evident truth, by which only those who could fall in line with its axiomatic structure, turning off their minds, were admitted into castrated science where they were no longer able to participate in discovery. The mathematical mechanism of attraction was the bait for the mental trap, which then allowed the would-be scientists to accept a whole religion of empiricism, chanting, "What the real substance of anything is we know not." And with their minds removed, were relegated to expressing their feelings of frustration through other venues. And finally, in form with the next consequence in the theorem lattice of Sarpi's model, this limitation of knowledge as sense perception and laws limited to sense perception leads to the mysticism of Newton's belief that the cause of attraction, which the formula showed, was a continuous miracle and only explainable as the result of an unknowable action by an unknowable Socinian God who immediately impels bodies towards each other constantly. Indeed, rather than Kepler's principle of...
Sorry, I guess, yeah, I might as well just read it there. Yeah, so footnote 42 is, in his last letter in a series to Reverend Bentley, later one of Newton's handlers of the Second Principia, in February 25th, 1693, Newton explains more about his idea whether or not gravity is an innate property of matter itself. Quote, "'Tis inconceivable that inanimate brute matter should, without the mediation of something else, which is not material, operate upon and affect other matter without mutual contact, as it must if gravitation, in the sense of Epicurus, be essential and inherent in it. And this is one reason why I desire you would not ascribe innate gravity to me. That gravity should be innate, inherent, and essential to matter, so that one body may act upon another at a distance, through a vacuum, without the mediation of anything else, by and through which their action or force may be conveyed from one to another, is to me so great an absurdity that I believe no man who has in philosophical matters any competent faculty of thinking can ever fall into it. Gravity must be caused by an agent acting constantly according to certain laws. But whether this agent be material or immaterial is a question I have left to the consideration of my readers." Whiston relayed the fact after Newton's death that Newton always thought attraction was caused by the power of the deity. This is the literal basis for the belief in Adam Smith's force that makes the market adjust itself, so that everything works out in the end, a fact making the whole lot of believers in the market economy a bunch of religious fanatics.
Indeed, rather than Kepler's principle of gravitation, which gave a sufficient reason for both elliptical motion and the particular ellipsis found in the solar system, through the creative principle of a continuous harmonic tuning of the system as a whole, reason was held as secondary to pure arbitrary will of the creator, a fact which Leibniz would later draw out as the true face of the beast in his correspondence with Clarke under the supervision of theologian and priest Abbé Conti. These were the new elements added to the second edition of the Principia. In sum, it was turned into a Sarpi manual of which he would be proud, and a weapon against Leibniz's science of reason and human creativity, which guided Republican thinkers to choose the promotion of the human mind. When this edition was finally published in 1713, Antonio Conti's strings were fully in effect, if not earlier, and he would from thenceforth take over the regulation of the acid Newton until his death. In the aftermath of Leibniz's death, Conti may have realized that choosing Newton for the task was a risky gamble, seeing as how many crucibles he had in his closet, but despite that fact, he deemed that Newton fit the bill of a new religion of the empire, as Sarpi's Descartes had served until he was rendered useless by Leibniz. With Leibniz safely dead, Conti spent the next 10 years cleaning up Newton's closet in preparation for his afterlife, and then proceeded as follows.
In footnote 43 on Conti, Conti personally fashioned an image of Newton in the early 1720s, cleaned from the true face which Leibniz had unveiled before his death. For the purpose of creating a general philosophy of pure mathematics, Conti devoted many of his writings to attempting to make the case that Newton did not share the beliefs which Leibniz had exposed, which, as we have seen, if allowed to be generally connected with Newton, would have ruined him for Conti's following project. As one example of this cleaning Newton's attraction into a pure mathematical formula, he had written that considering hypotheses, isn't it better to, quote, be satisfied with the one which in a strict sense is not considered a hypothesis, end quote. Having explicitly defined hypothesis as a math formula, he continued that concerning the inverse square law, quote, so far we have been fairly lucky because this hypothesis explains more than any other. The more we examine nature, the more we observe, the more the hypothesis is confirmed. So, end quote. So there is no reason to, quote, lose ourselves in the abyss where all is equally dark and dangerous, end quote, by connecting them to Newton's force of attraction, but this more general sophistical aim, real causes. Then it says, Badolini, un abate libero pensatore tra Newton e Voltaire, 1968. Oh, that's where this comes from. Okay, from 1968. So, yeah, so the idea of taking ideas and trying to reduce them to math formulas and calling that ideas, that won't get you very far if you want to be a creative scientist. I think, what do you guys think? I think actually what time is it? It's 9:48. We're at section 3. Yeah, this paper is dense. I always underestimate how big this thing is. So let's end the reading here, and we'll remember number 3 next week. Sarpi wins Europe. We'll pick it up there. So I'll just do a stop share. What do you guys think? This is rigorous as hell, eh?
Yes, absolutely brilliant. This should be compulsory material in high schools.
Yeah. Imagine, eh? What a different world this would be.
Yeah.
What's great is to take notes of some of the names that he drops, because sometimes, the first time reading through the stuff, a lot of these things are names, and you could just take note. And anybody listening, I've used this technique, and it's useful over time just to do a Google search, and just see who these people are, and it puts a little bit more flesh on and personality onto the bones of the words, and the story just begins to fill itself out, more and more as a living drama.
No, absolutely. No, I read the name Sarpi for the first time when I read the Webster Tar play.
Mm-hmm.
And well, that's truly universal history for me.
Yeah. Well, it's the battle of the mind, That's what Schiller explained real universal history as, is the battle for who controls the process in which the mind is cultivated and transmits itself to the future generations. So yeah, Sarpi's a real evil warrior in that battle.
Well, I repeat myself, but I think that one practical goal for the present fight would be to make this text compulsory material for high schools. You know, it's so long, it could be read in a week, okay? But that week would be extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely. With secondary material, like groups could then read essays, like select essays by the good guys, by Leibniz and by Jonathan Swift, from Gulliver's Travels, attacking the Laputans, and then compare it to what the actual people are saying in the Royal Academy. What are they doing? Because they are trying to extract things like, what is it? Rainbows and light from cucumbers. They're actually trying the things that Newton, that Swift is making fun of in Gulliver's Travels in this academy, or what is it, like trying to get food out of poop or something? They're actually doing these things in real life in London in the Royal Academy. So it's not just fiction. He's actually making fun, literally, politically, of this Rosicrucian mystical thing that's trying to call itself science. We lost Quan. Jerry, have you ever read this thing?
No, this is my first time reading it. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's also, I really enjoy it because, I told you I'm reading right now The Electric Universe, and they're doing this whole attack on Newton as well. Because even today, Newton's, universe, they're still trying to use it to explain phenomenon in the universe and galaxies, and it just can't explain it. And they have to keep inventing all these absurd things like black hole and dark matter. And but this fight that Leibniz had, it's still ongoing today.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. It's weird, that they acknowledge, like, even modern science acknowledges that Newton was superseded by the discoveries or the redefinition of space-time by Einstein and Planck. They say it, but then all of their thinking is still trapped by all of these Newtonian assumptions and definitions of what is gravity and what is force, what is the method of thinking. They're yeah.
They give us their interpretation of Einstein. What Einstein really was, but Einstein didn't know. That's what they're trying to say. It really is absurd. Oh.
He really that was Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell, I was surprised that he wrote a book on Einstein's discovery that shaped a straw man of Einstein's mind in a Newtonian persona. And so and he said, like, I love Einstein. Here's so great, but nobody understands Einstein. So let me popularize it for the world. And so when people think that they're either celebrating Einstein or a lot of the electric universe people who are more creative, they tend to attack Einstein. They're not attacking Einstein. They're attacking Bertrand Russell's painting of the picture of what Einstein was. And the people who are loving Einstein are actually loving Newton, and they don't even realize it. They think they're loving Einstein, but no, it's Newton with the mustache and crazy hair. Yeah.
Yes.
Which book did you buy? Who was the author of this Electric Universe book?
Walt Thornhill and David Talbot. That one.
Ah. Okay. Yeah, I'm halfway through the Velikovsky book. I got pulled into other research, but it's not bad. I mean, it's really not the what it was the one I got was
Ages in Chaos, or
no, the other one, the other famous one,
Worlds in Collision.
Worlds in right. Yeah, Worlds in Collision, and it's good. I don't mind it. I think he's going through all these different. He's very rigorous in the sense of going through all these different cultures around the world, and their myths, and the native cultures and the so many. I mean, so he's got a comprehensive way of looking and seeing these constants in their myths.
Mhm.
And I think he's probably the most rigorous guy to do it that way, and then creating hypotheses of what could account for these different stories of destruction from the heavens and whatever. And I think that there's some good grounds, but I think he then gets a little bit too confident in the details and of what he thinks caused these things.
Mhm.
Gets too ambitious and enthusiastic, and then starts just saying everything that the
Oh,
ancients did in their mythologies. Everything is literally this, like Venus springing forth out of Saturn, and it becomes
oh,
too
yes.
literal, I think. But there's good stuff in there, really good stuff that I think has a lot of value.
Yeah. The only one of Velikovsky I really read was the first little critique he does attacking gravity
Hmm.
before he writes the books. I forget when he wrote it, maybe 1940 or something,
That was the age.
which is very, very interesting.
Hmm.
Because in the Electric Universe, they discussed that, but then they had their fight with Velikovsky, who wouldn't quite break with certain Newtonian aspects of it.
Hmm.
So,
Interesting.
interesting fellow, yes.
But yeah, it's the same fight, like you said. It's the same idea that was being fought over back 300 and so years ago. Same thing.
Oh, yeah, and even further. I mean, they keep talking about Epicurean and Democritus. I mean, these are the people Plato was fighting, the atomists.
Who's bringing this up? Epicurus and
Uh,
Democritus.
Newton discusses that.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
right.
and Leibniz as well. In a lot of his short little writings,
Yeah.
he's always attacking the atomists, and he refers to them Epicurean and Democritus.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Well, yeah.
there's this story where Plato hated Democritus so bad that anytime he saw one of his books, he burnt them.
Oh no, really?
Oh yeah, yeah, he really hated Democritus. He would never mention his name. At least that's the story.
Hmm.
Yes.
That's funny because like one of the things that a lot of these Bertrand Russell, like, because Bertrand Russell also, when he wrote about Leibniz, because he's also the authority not only on Einstein but on Leibniz. Apparently, that's what also people think of when they think of Leibniz, as Bertrand Russell's scarecrow of Leibniz, and he
Right.
describes Leibniz's monads as Democritus's atoms. That everything is made up, because Leibniz, like, everything is made up of simple substances, right? That are undivisible
Yeah.
but have yearning. And Leibniz is creating a very challenging idea of the fabric of space-time, and in a metaphysical, spiritual, and material way, because he sees all of the material universe as a shadow of a higher spiritual universe. And so he builds his entire system of science around that understanding, and his monads are a key idea. But then what Bertrand Russell does is he says, yeah, the monads are like Democritus's atoms. They're just irreducible
Yeah.
little pieces of sand that just make up everything with like impulses, and he makes fun of it. But yeah,
He's like doing the same thing as Conti.
same thing. Yeah,
Yeah, interesting.
these guys are good at being evil, I gotta say.
Yes.
A lot of endurance to like pass these traditions of evil on generation to generation. Like, fuck, it's so unnatural and so hard. Like, so much work is put into this.
Yeah. Well, they're defending their empire, really. It's not so much their physics as it's their he refers to it as Venetian monetarism is really what they're defending.
Mm-hmm.
And you need this strange mathematical principia to somehow explain how it works. The invisible hand of the market, the invisible hand of gravity. Somehow, magically, everything is attracted somehow through
exactly.
yes, through empty space. How can it through nothingness. It still does. The magic hand.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Fucking weird.
And that's what everyone is taught in school,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Well, like
and it's only you finally try to figure this out and you realize that there's something wrong here.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, the idea of like these, there's something instinctively, naturally ugly, like absurd with the idea that there's no reason or purpose built into the universe or nature, and that things are just complex, and complexity just self-organizes. So whatever, just accept it. Don't think about it too much. It's ridiculous.
Or the power of God just does it.
Well, yeah, that's just God. That's just that's the other extreme. It just is because it is. God wants it, and it's like, why is there evil in the world? Because God made it that way. But why did He do it that way? Just accept it. It's like, wait a minute. I think you're not thinking about this enough. Or I think you're trying to put me to sleep. Stop that.
Yes.
Yeah.
No hypotheses are allowed.
No.
No. Only big bangs.
It's like, why did God give us reason and a conscience? Maybe it's to do something about injustice. Maybe, maybe it's to be an instrument of His will to do good. Maybe is that more reasonable? Perhaps. No. Just it's to play with us and to give us false hope because He's sick. Because we live in a sick universe. It's like Iago.
Well, yes, because that's their outlook. It is a sick universe to them.
Yeah.
To a Newton. Spending your whole life trying to turn lead into gold and you can't do it.
Yeah, right. So next week, next week we'll pick up in part 3, and I guess it'll be 2 more sessions. Obviously, this is taking a while. So, and he'll start getting into physical economy and the battle over economics, which is where it gets really juicy, to see how this all snaps together so naturally. And then after that, I'm thinking we'll read some Leibniz right? Why not?
That would be good. Yes. We're all primed for it now.
Yeah, I think so.
After Max Planck, and after this, now we're ready for Leibniz.
Yeah. And at that point, either we'll go in a Vernadskian direction or we'll go in a Henry C. Carey direction. I'm not too sure. I don't know. But either way, it'll all converge. It'll all be natural no matter what we choose.
It's all good.
All right, guys. So till I guess Sunday, we'll have Dr. Nikolai Petro going through the Orestes trilogy. And this guy's a high level player. He's really good. So yeah, it'll be fun.
Well, that should be exciting.
Yep.
Yes.
Alrighty. Bye, Eureka.
Okay. Bye, Eureka.
Bye. See you next time.
Ciao.
Okay. Ciao.